Okay, getting broadcast, getting stream. Hello, Founder fans. Jason here. Thank you so much for coming, and we are going to discuss some stories. Most notably, we are going to be discussing the last 7 Founders of the Day from my website, founderoftheday.com, where I've published 7 articles each week, and this week, we're going to talk about what I learned. Thank you, everyone. I see some people commenting already. Hi, Matthew. Hi, TJ. Thank you so much for being here. TJ, welcome from the smoky West Coast. Still using my new setup. Going to get right into it, but did just want to acknowledge that I'm trying the camera over here this week to see how it feels. Definitely let me know what you think. Still have not received my webcam for some reason. It was ordered a month ago. Amazon actually has canceled that webcam, despite everything being here for weeks. Everything else was here when I rearranged, except the webcam. I have ordered another one. Hopefully this is the last time I'm shooting from my phone. Hopefully we don't have the problems we had last week. It says excellent condition. I also happened to upgrade my internet to the pricey one just 2 weeks ago, and then everything started working poorly. What do you know, Time Warner? Thanks for a monopoly. Anyway, don't want to have to get into a net neutrality discussion right now, but we are going to talk about the American Revolution. So thank you guys for coming. Thank you for hitting like. Let's get this going. Last Thursday, I wrote an article about a woman named Mary Lindley Murray. I will say, I note, not everyone this week is necessarily a founder. Actually, we're talking about a few people who weren't Americans this week, and Mary Lindley Murray may very well have been a loyalist. Now, her husband and son would both have... Thank you, Matthew. I'm glad it's better. Mary Lindley Murray's husband and son would both be patriots. Actually, her husband had some ships that had tea in New York Harbor. When they had the New York Tea Party, had some tea dumped into the ocean. Now, that didn't stop Mary Lindley Murray from saving many soldiers. Probably about 3,000 soldiers under General Israel Putnam. Almost said Rufus. That was his cousin. General Israel Putnam participated in the battles in New York City. And when the British attacked and took Kips Bay, well, Israel Putnam had to evacuate his thousands of soldiers. Again, approximately 3,000 soldiers. And they evacuated, but while they were leaving, well, what do you know? They happened to be walking north on the coast of Manhattan Island, and they were going to a road where they would cut inland. But coming down the road the other way was British General, I believe it was General Howe actually leading it. I believe. Yes, British General Howe, glad I checked, was leading a much bigger army south on the same road. Now, Mary Lindley Murray was very nice and invited General Howe in for tea. Now, this was extraordinarily fortunate for Israel Putnam and his American revolutionaries traveling north, because her house was just north of the road they anticipated cutting inland on. She invited him in for tea. Being a gentleman, Howe and his officers just could not refuse, and they stopped their entire army to have tea with Mary Lindley Murray. Now, Howe definitely didn't realize that the Patriots were right up the road, 3,500 or so of them, and he stopped for tea, giving the Patriots time to turn and escape. Of course, during these battles, many people died, unfortunately, but this army, an army, under, not the Continental Army, but an army of soldiers under Israel Putnam was able to escape. Now, Mary Lindley Murray's motives for saving all these soldiers are still up in the air. Now, we like to tell the story that she was a secret patriot and wanted to help them escape. The truth of the matter is, first of all, we don't know the truth, but she was a Quaker, which they were kind of against violence the whole time, and still technically are. But they were very much against the violence of the war, so she may have just wanted to prevent violence. She also may have not wanted a war to break out on her property. She had a very expensive house on Kips Bay, and probably did not want to have to clean up from a bloodbath. Either way, Mary Lindley Murray did end up saving a big segment of the Continental Army that day. And I should also note, her son was also a loyalist, and her husband stayed around. Her and her husband stayed around after the war, because as Quakers, they were able to kind of keep their noses out of it, and the fact that Mary Lindley Murray helped so many soldiers, the Continental Army didn't seem so upset when they came back into New York. But her son was a loyalist, and he did end up going to Britain, but he actually started writing school books and became one of the best-selling authors of the 19th century. In fact, sold millions and millions and millions of school books, textbooks, in the United States in the first handful of years under the Jefferson and Adams and Madison administrations. So the Murray family still did have a big influence on the United States. Also, I'm glad I checked because apparently I double-checked how to spell Murray, M-U-R-R-A-Y, which I think is how Bill Murray spells it. I had spelled it without the A and with the A. I had spelled it differently throughout the whole paper when I wrote it, and went back and had to double-check. Oh no, I said, oh no, I've been spelling it wrong. So I went back to fix it, and oh no, it's right. Oh wait, no, it's wrong here? What was I thinking? Anyway, fun fact on the side. Let's continue. If there's any questions, that's what I'm here for. That's why we're doing it live, so I can answer on the fly. See if you can stump me. It's not that out of the ordinary. I don't know everything. This is what I learned, and I'm trying to learn with you guys. So thank you so much for being here. Now, on Friday, I wrote my Anti-Federalist Fridays. For those of you who are new, I spent a year and a half writing Federalist Fridays, covering every Federalist paper. And now, a few months back, I started writing about Anti-Federalists. And this one is about William Grayson. Now, this is the first one that was an Anti-Federalist paper. These were two speeches that Grayson gave on the floor of the Virginia Ratification Convention against the United States Constitution, and outlining arguments that not only he had, but many of the Anti-Federalists had. Though they did become printed in transcript and have become part of the pantheon that most people would consider Anti-Federalist papers. And since I read them this week, I wanted to write about them. I will say I have written an article specifically about William Grayson, very interesting founder in his own right, but he's on the floor of the Virginia Convention. He gives a speech that's become known as "We Have Been Told of Phantoms," and I just think that is a brilliant title for a thing of this nature, and it kind of relates to much of the modern politics we have today in a fashion, though I'm not getting into that, but the phantoms he was talking about, he's saying, listen, they're telling us we need this new constitution because of all these reasons. Things like, what if we get invaded by a foreign nation? Or what if a foreign nation doesn't want to trade with us because individual states don't have enough credit? Ooh, what if there's a dispute between states and the states go to war? And William Grayson says these are phantoms. We're on really good terms, even at this point, just, technically 3 years after the war officially ended. We're already on pretty good terms with Great Britain. We've been on good terms with France this whole time. Spain's a pain in the butt, but they helped us in the war. The Netherlands keeps giving us credit, keeps doing it. Russia's staying out of it, but they're fine with us. Who are we afraid of? The Native Americans? Well, we've already been able to prevent Native Americans from really invading the colonies for 100+ years, and additionally, we're friends, so we will help each other out. And then the best thing, and I'm gonna throw out a quote here. He says, and as for the states coming after each other, as far as Virginia, speaking as a Virginian at the Virginia Convention, calls them the Carolinas. Are the Carolinas going to invade us, quote, mounted on alligators? and those are just some of the many phantoms that he was saying. A lot, and again, we see this a lot today, where we're given a lot of fear. We're told to be afraid of a lot of things, specifically for specifically back then, it was we need to be afraid of all these things. And Grayson's like, we have nothing to be afraid of. We just won the war. If there's a war, obviously we're good at getting together and forming an army at a whim. At least now we have the Articles of Confederation. Before we didn't have anything. We just kind of did it. So that's the We've Been Told of Phantom speech. And then just a few days later, Grayson gets back on the floor. And this speech has become known more typically as on the mode of electing the president. And he's very concerned about the fact that if the Electoral College doesn't have a majority, then the decision on who should be president actually goes to the House of Representatives. And especially back when whoever got the most votes was president, and whoever got the second most was vice president, this concerned him greatly. He actually runs through the mathematics of it and uses the math at the time, but he basically says, listen, if you have 4 candidates that all get exactly the same amount of votes, and you have one candidate that gets 2 votes, no one has a majority, and that'll go to the House of Representatives. And if the House of Representatives has a politician that they're friendly with, maybe it's one of these people, then that person who got one vote could become president. And these 4 people who got most of the votes couldn't be a president. So that's a problem. And this kind of thing would become a problem, most notably in 2000. The 26 election, when John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay made their bargain to beat Andrew Jackson. It's essentially what happened, although it wasn't some person who got one vote that came out of nowhere. It was someone who got a lot of votes in that scenario. So those are the Anti-Federalists from papers or speeches from William Grayson. Now, I do want to note, just a year and a half later, William Grayson was elected as an inaugural member of the United States Senate, one of only 26 people to serve in the first United States Senate. And in fact, Grayson, while he was there, he is most famous for being the first sitting senator to die in office. So William Grayson, as a anti-federalist who became a part of the federal government, is most famous for how he died, which is a shame. But them's the breaks. At least he's famous. I don't know what to say. So thank you. Hi, Ethan. Thank you for coming. Welcome aboard. I did see you pop in, but I'm trying to learn to continue through what I'm saying when I see you guys talk to me and then double back and acknowledge it, to not be mean, but I don't want to pause and ruin it for people who are watching later and aren't live, because some people do watch back, and I appreciate you too. Don't forget to hit like if you're not live. If you are live, looks like you probably did hit like, so thanks a bunch. So, let's move to this weekend. As a reminder, over the weekends, I republish old articles because I'm approaching 900 of them, and I don't want to waste them, and they're fun, and I'd like to talk about them. So, I reposted an article about John Rutledge. I tried to go, this is a very old article of mine, and I tried to go with like big clickbaity title, where I called it Chief Justice John Rutledge Tries to Kill Himself. I don't like that title. I could have made it sexier while still being clickbaity. I didn't. Oh well. That's the end of his life. But the beginning of his life, John Rutledge, tries to kill himself. It's not actually the end, but we'll get there. Spoiler alert. John Rutledge is an extremely, extremely important American founder. It is hard to overstate how important John Rutledge was, despite the fact that we really don't hear a lot from him. John Rutledge was a 26-year-old representative in the South Carolina colonial government when he traveled all the way to New York City to be the youngest member of the Stamp Act Congress. Back in 1765, a decade before Revolution, John Rutledge had traveled to New York to participate in the Stamp Act Congress, and he oversaw the committee that wrote a letter to the House of Lords. So the Stamp Act Congress was, they filed their grievances. They had problems with the stamp tax and several other taxes. And so they wrote 3 letters, one to the king, one to the House of Lords, and one to the House of Commons. I'm sorry, I misspoke. Rutledge oversaw the committee that wrote the letter to the House of Lords. And what happened with the Stamp Act Congress is they sent these grievances to England, and they worked. Imagine that. The king actually said, or not the king, but Parliament actually said, and I apologize, there's a lot of motorcycles today. I put in soundproofing but didn't close that window. I'm a dummy. Anyway, the King of England and Parliament were like, okay, yeah. They did put in a clause saying that they could rule for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. So they basically said, yeah, we could. We're not going to, but we could make these laws. But either way, the colonies got together for the first time, and they wrote letters saying, this is the problem, this is why we don't like it, we think you'll understand if you pay attention. And it worked. 10 years later, when the First Continental Congress makes it, they thought the same thing. The First Continental Congress got together, wrote some letters, and then broke up and said, if this isn't resolved by next April, we'll get back together. And this time it didn't work. But John Rutledge, who was now in his mid-30s, was also at the First Continental Congress and also signed the Continental Association and the letters to England. Now, he went back to the Second Continental Congress, but he didn't sign the Declaration of Independence because he was elected as the first governor of South Carolina. At the time, it was President before they had become a state. The language twists and turns around itself, but essentially was elected as the first governor of South Carolina, and he went back to deal with that. He happened to be replaced by his brother Edward Rutledge, who would sign the Declaration of Independence. Edward Rutledge would be a very important founder in his own right. We're not going to get into that right now. But John Rutledge goes back. He oversees South Carolina through a lot of the war. That's his main focus is as chief executive, as commander-in-chief of the South Carolina militia, making sure, unsuccessfully making sure the British didn't invade. He's there for the first 3 years. A lot of the states had put in 3-year term limits for things like governor at the time, and he filled out his term. He went back to the Continental Congress for some time. He was elected to the Court of Chancery in South Carolina, which is similar to the Supreme Court of the state. Then, years later, John Rutledge, who, again, 23 years earlier was at the Stamp Act Congress and the First Continental Congress, he's sent to the Constitutional Convention. And he is one of the few people who apparently attended every single meeting of the Constitutional Convention. And while he was a moderate who didn't play a large role in formulating the document and in the debates themselves, he was in charge of the Committee of Detail, which made the first draft of the United States Constitution. Now, there were at least three drafts in full before the final one was created, but the first one's interesting because all the rest were based off this. A lot of changes were made, except there were certain parliamentary procedures in the United States Constitution that everyone used. All the states used it. They used it when they were colonies, the First Continental Congress, Great Britain, France, and Spain. Most of the governments in the Western world had certain procedures that everyone just kind of used. Things like forming committees and how votes were cast, things of that nature, that no one really thought twice about, that they had just assumed this is how it's going to be done. So they wrote that down. And John Rutledge oversaw writing that down. And most of those standard procedures are still standard procedures in the United States government right now today. After this, our friend John Rutledge is chosen by newly minted President George Washington as an Associate Justice on the United States Supreme Court, an inaugural justice on the United States Supreme Court. And John Rutledge does a pretty good job, so much so that when John Jay resigns as Chief Justice, because he wants to go be governor of New York, John Rutledge is appointed as interim Chief Justice of the United States, and he is considered the second Chief Justice in the history of the United States of America. Now, 30 years after he was at the technically less, but almost 30 years after he was at the Stamp Act Congress in New York so many decades before. Now, he is nominated to take over as the full-time permanent second Chief Justice of the United States. Unfortunately, this is about the time that John Jay, who had left Chief Justice to be in New York, that happened to coincide with him going to England as a special ambassador to work out what became known as the Jay Treaty. And the Jay Treaty had some benefits, but it is largely regarded, at least at the time, was largely regarded as not all that great. And many people from the South, including someone from South Carolina named John Rutledge, didn't really love it. Rutledge gave a speech that talked a lot of trash about the Jay Treaty and actually said some really negative things about George Washington himself. Now, if you are currently nominated to be Chief Justice of the United States of America, it's generally a good idea not to talk too much trash about the president who nominated you. Fortunately, this was lost on John Rutledge, and he did not receive the position. Oliver Ellsworth would take over that position, do a great job for several years, until John Marshall would come in and take over for the rest of eternity. That's also another story. But John Rutledge, now in his mid-50s, had put a lifetime into building the United States of America. And he was very proud of his service. And the fact that he made this one small mistake, first of all, he was super embarrassed that he was called out by almost everyone on both sides, because most people realize we need George Washington. He's the Washington. He's holding this all together while we figure it out. Sure, there'll be another president eventually, but we need Washington here while we figure it out. Maybe there's some bumps along the way. Maybe the Jay Treaty wasn't the best thing in the whole wide world, but it happened, and we need to let George Washington be super uber respected as if he was a king. Not because we wanted a king, but because, at least to get a republic off the ground, we kind of just need to pretend he is for a little bit. Obviously, this was not a hard and fast rule. There were many people, especially in newspapers, that talked a lot of trash about Washington, especially as the years went on. but not when you're running for Chief Justice. And this got to John Rutledge, and Rutledge ended up actually attempting suicide by jumping off a dock in South Carolina. Fortunately for him, he was rescued by two slaves who were passing by, saw him jump in, thought he fell in, and pulled him out. And then he did not get the position, as I said, of Chief Justice, and he quietly retired, spending the rest of his life in private business and solitude, pretty much. I shouldn't say solitude, but out of the public eye. So that's the story of John Rutledge. I'm sure I've left a ton out. I've put a lot more time into him than I anticipated, but thank you guys for watching, and thank you so much for hitting like. Let's move on to a name I'm definitely going to mispronounce. His name is Chevalier de la Luzerne. Luzerne. I'm going to call him Luzerne. Like we call him Lafayette, even though his name is like Marc Paul Gilbert de Lafayette. We're going to call this French dude Luzerne. He's not really a founding father because he is not American. He was French. But if you're watching this, you'll probably know that the French ended up joining the Americans in the Revolution. It took a few years, and eventually the French first acknowledged the United States as an independent nation. And then they joined the war. And right when they joined the war, well, they appointed an ambassador to this new country that they get to appoint an ambassador for. What fun! They appoint the Chevalier de la Luzerne. Now, Luzerne was already a major general in the French army. He had served in the 7 Years' War, really got a lot of respect, and after that he had served around Europe in smaller capacities as a minister. After this, he decides to go to... He accepts an appointment to the United States, and he comes to the United States, and, well, he makes some fast friends. So, Luzerne has surprisingly Republican ideals for a gentleman who was appointed by the King of France to come to the United States. But one of the reasons he was chosen was because of this, because the king knew he would get along pretty swimmingly with most people, and he did. He comes to the United States, and he starts working with the Continental Congress. Now, first of all, as I said, the France recognized the United States as an independent nation, but at the time, the United States, if you've watched this channel for any period of time, you'll know I like to point this out. Under the Articles of Confederation, the United States looked at themselves as 13 separate countries. This was a problem because I shouldn't have even said Articles of Confederation. By the time Luzerne arrives, there is no Articles of Confederation. It's there, it's written. Most people have signed it, but Maryland has not. It causes a lot of grief for someone like Luzerne, who's supposed to look out for France's interests, both to win the war and as a trading partner. And he's dealing with the Continental Congress, but he's also dealing with 13 separate states. So he's got 14 countries when an ambassador is only supposed to get one. But that's not what happened now, is it? Because of this, Luzerne becomes a very big proponent for the Articles of Confederation because, hey, I should only be dealing with one body here, and I got to deal with all this mess. Now, Maryland had been holding out on the Articles of Confederation for several years. It was already 1781 when Maryland's big problem was Virginia laid claim to a lot of western lands that was not necessarily officially part of the colony of Virginia when the war broke out. They were claiming it when the war broke out, at least individual Virginians were. But the state of Virginia, once independence was had, was kind of saying, we want this. Now Maryland, which if you look at a map, Maryland kind of stretches out to the end of Pennsylvania and Virginia in there too. They were like, we don't want it to be these 12 little colonies in Virginia having the entire continent of North America. That's not going to work out for us. So they were arguing very heavily for all western lands to be ceded to the federal government under the Articles of Confederation. So Luzerne comes in and he starts talking to Maryland like, guys, come on, this is impossible for me. And it just so happens Maryland was a little nervous about getting invaded by the British. What do you know? There's a war going on. And they turn to Luzerne and say, hey, is there any way you can help us get some of your French troops coming over to come to Maryland? And Luzerne says, yeah, you better go sign that Articles of Confederation. Now, this just happened to coincide with Virginia ceding all land claims to the continent, the Articles of Confederation and the Continental Congress. So at this point, Maryland said, okay, we're in, and signed it. There's an argument to be made that it was the ceding of that western land they had been holding out for that Maryland signed it, and there is an argument to be made that Luzerne withholding troops got them to sign it. The truth of the matter is probably a little bit of both. This is extraordinarily important because when Maryland signed it, that was the 13th state to sign it, and the Articles of Confederation officially became the first government of the United States of America, which made that we officially had a United States of America. So Luzerne, that's essentially, I've squeezed in what he was given the best position that a French minister could have, or French ambassador can have. He was appointed as minister to Great Britain. That is the life of Chevalier de Luzerne. I'm out of breath. I'm getting really pumped today. I'm going to take a sip of water real quick. Those of you who've watched for any bit of time before know it's getting hot under these lights. And while I'm here, guys, leave me a comment. Am I super bright, or did I just turn up the brightness on my new monitor too much? Do I look normal, or am I way bright? Not that it matters. By this time next week, I should have my new camera I've been waiting over a month for, and we can really make these videos pop, I guess. Let's talk about David Barclay. Let's talk about someone else who's not an American founder. I did not do this on purpose. I just didn't think about it. I write my articles a little bit in advance. Am I talking too fast, TJ? I am bright. Okay, good to know. Thank you, guys. I will try and talk a little bit slower and be dimmer. I don't... Let's try this. Let's do a little timeout. Is that better? Let me know. I'm ahead, so we'll see. Okay. Let's talk about David Barclay. Now, you may or may not know... Oh, here I go. There we go. Is it better? Still real bright. Still real bright. Is it? Is that better? Is that too dark? I guess we'll see. Anyway, David Barclay. You might know the name Barclay because there's a bank that's like worldwide and super wealthy, and they're all over the place, and it's still very bright. Okay, back to it. Sorry for the interruption. We'll figure it out when the new camera comes. It'll be great. David Barclay is the Barclay banks that's all over the world. You got like Barclay Center in New York. We got a Barclay building here in Syracuse. It's a big name and a big bank. It was already called Barclay Center. It was already the Barclay Bank when he inherited it. It is still the Barclay Bank, and that's where he had his wealth from. I'm just associating that because Barclay was one of the English merchants living in London who, when the Stamp Act was repealed, one of the reasons was it was English merchants were saying, hey, we're losing all our money because the Americans are boycotting us. 10 years later, the Americans are boycotting again. We're losing all our money. And he wants to put something together. So he works with a handful of people in England, including an older gentleman named Benjamin Franklin, who is already serving as an agent to many different colonies in North America. They work together and create what became known as Barclay's Plan of Reconciliation. Excuse me, that's something right. I've stumbled onto this last week, and I was very surprised I had never heard of it before, but that's because nothing much came of it. It was a recommendation to the King and Parliament that everyone ignored. So it was just after the Boston Tea Party that Barclay started working with Washington. The Boston Tea Party was in December, and the following January into February, he starts working with Ben Franklin and a few other people to come up with some kind of plan to fix things. Now, again, like I said, it doesn't work out, but it's very interesting to note. The core of his plan, it does bear a lot of resemblance to other plans that were trying to solve the problem. But what specifically stuck out to me was Barclay said, hey, if the Americans pay for the tea that was wasted in Boston Harbor, because in today's standards, it's millions of dollars of tea was dumped into the ocean and ruined. It's a lot. So if the colony of Boston, or at least the American colonies, can figure out a way to pay for the tea, then we'll let them pay for their own governors and judges. Now, I know it sounds like, hey, they're just making the Americans pay for everything. That's not fair. But in the Declaration of Independence itself that came about 2.5 years later, the Americans, one of their grievances is the king pays for the governors and the judges, which means they are responsible to the king and parliament, not the people. And they wanted to raise taxes locally to pay for their own representatives locally so that they could control them better. That they can stop paying them if they wanted to. With the power of the purse, their colonial assembly could stop paying the governor. They could pay someone else to do it. Money is a very powerful tool when it comes to government. Some might argue that those who control the money control the country. I've heard that said more eloquently before. I can't think of it off the top of my head. Either way, Barclay's plan of reconciliation did just this. It said, hey, listen, colonies, why don't we let you pay for your judges and your governors like you want? You get your own representation. But you gotta pay for all that tea you wasted. Now again, this didn't go anywhere because Parliament was like, no, we're in charge. So obviously that didn't work out, but it was a very interesting attempt that I wanted to bring people's attention. And as for Barclay, there's one other thing that's extraordinarily interesting in him, and it comes well after the Revolution. Barclay, it turns out, property and money changes hands with wealthy people all the time, and it turned out he got a bit of property in Jamaica that had slaves in it. Now, he was an early abolitionist, and he took these 30 slaves in Jamaica, and he moved them to Pennsylvania, which had just a decade earlier outlawed slavery, and he bought some land there, and he put them there, and he tried to educate them on how to live as free people. He took the slaves he had, that he kind of stumbled into, and he thought slavery was wrong, so he moved them to Pennsylvania and generously and actively attempted to free them and teach them how to be free. So, again, this was a time where the going way, the means that was used to get rid of slavery in the states and countries that did was generally called gradual emancipation, where they would give the slaves, they'd say, you'll be free in 10, 20 years. Like in New York, from 1779, they passed the law manumitting slaves, but anyone alive that day was not free for another 28 years, or something to that effect, because you had to learn how to be free, what it meant to be a citizen of your country. It's hard for us to hear something like that today, because we just assume, these are natural born rights and everyone should be free. But when they wrote the Constitution, the going idea was, well, we only have elites vote because there's a certain amount of virtue necessary in the people to be able to carry on a government like this. You need to be educated in how society works to contribute to it appropriately. Now, whether that's right or wrong is not for me to decide. That's just the attitude they had then. And in fact, that's actually the attitude that people like Abraham Lincoln had decades later going into the Civil War. Lincoln famously said if he could win the war without freeing any slaves, he'd do it. And if he could win the war by freeing all of them, he'd do that also. But going in, his plan was gradual emancipation. It just seemed better for everyone, especially the slaves, to just be thrown out on your own. At least that was the argument. Not that I'm making it, that's just the attitude that was there. But we're not getting into the Civil War. Matthew asking, did it work? His experiment in abolition, if that's what you're asking about, I believe so. I haven't seen much about it, but Pennsylvania was at the time working very hard to gradually educate all of the black Americans in their community to be free in Pennsylvania. And, within a few decades, everyone was free in Pennsylvania, so I suppose it did. Although, as for his specific experiment, I don't know a ton about that itself. It would be very interesting to look into. I didn't have all that much time. I had to move on to the next founder, man. Gotta write 5 of these a week. But yeah, they were freed and educated. So, if you're asking if they were freed and educated, yes. Did they live prosperous lives? I mean, they all get their own day. I need to give them all their own day. Apparently, now that I'm saying it, that's a lot of work. Anyway, speaking of work, let's talk about another founder, because after David Beardley, what are we at yesterday? We got 2 more. Okay, 2 more. 30 minutes. We'll try and keep it under 45 minutes today. That's my goal. I want to get right to the stories. Right to the stories, but we experimented with the lighting a little bit. Thank you so much. Still looks super bright. Don't know why. and because it looks very dark over here. And I spoke a lot about John Rutledge, rightfully so. Today we're going to talk about Nathan Hale. No, not that Nathan Hale. See, that's why I wrote this article. When you hear the name Nathan Hale, there's a pretty good chance that you hear, my only regret is I have but one life to give for my country, because famously, Nathan Hale was hung as a spy and misquoted that quote. We're not going to get into that now. Come at me in the comments. It's that Nathan Hale was given that quote probably by a friend who knew he liked Cato's Letters, which was a popular reading at the time, and it's a quote from Cato's Letters. This Nathan Hale, totally unrelated, guy from New Hampshire, but as a young man, in his mid-20s, he had already started a town in New Hampshire with several people, and he was captain of that town's very small militia, and he was the president of that town's council. Now, there's a war that breaks out down at Lexington and Concord, and he leads his small group of Minutemen down there. And over the ensuing 2 years, he serves at Bunker Hill. Over the ensuing he serves in many battles, and he makes his way up. And by the summer of 1777, he's risen to colonel, and he's stationed at Fort Ticonderoga in New York. Fort Ticonderoga was always more important to the people then than it actually was. It seemed like a very important base, but it was kind of in ruins and not as easy to defend as it should have been. So while Hale's there, he's serving under Arthur St. Clair, who is a major general who decides to retreat because the British are there and they're surrounded and they don't have any food coming in because they're in the middle of the woods. It's not really as good a place it's on a hillside, should be a really easy, great place to defend. It's super cool if you go there now, although what's there now has been rebuilt. It's not the actual fort, but it's modeled to look like the actual fort. And it's very cool, but they decide to retreat. So they're retreating, and Colonel Nathan Hale is in charge of the defense. I'm sorry, not the defense, the rear guard. There it is. The rear guard. So essentially, he's at the back of Arthur St. Clair's army that's trudging through the woods. There are a few other people there with him and men to oversee, but they are found and attacked in the Battle of Hubbardton. Now, Hubbardton is a super insignificant battle. It was the advanced forces of the British who accidentally caught up to the rear guard, and neither of them had armies to help them, and they started fighting, and then it ended pretty quick. But it's important because it is the first time there was actual blood drawn during the Saratoga campaign. And the Saratoga campaign ended up being the one that changed the war. Huge victory for the Americans. Got the French on board with the Americans. Astounding defeat for the British, who thought they had it in the bag. Especially when they got to Ticonderoga. Everyone thought Ticonderoga was so important. The British took Ticonderoga. They're like, great, we won. Now we'll just waltz into Albany. Not how it happened. But unfortunately for Colonel Nathan Hale, he is taken prisoner at the Battle of Hubbardton. And he's brought to Canada. But he's an officer. And although no one seemed to care if privates languished in prison, officers generally were thought to have some money, and we can't have our wealthy elites in prison. Now, can we? So usually they would try and exchange officers, but at that time, the Continental Army didn't really have anyone on par with Colonel Nathan Hale to exchange. So, excuse me, Nathan Hale was left, excuse me. Oh, thank you, Mendez. I appreciate your courtesy. See you when you get back on repeat. Anyway, there was no one to exchange Colonel Nathan Hale for, so Nathan Hale is brought to the Canada, and then he's released on parole, which was something they did back then. They literally said to him, go home. Go back to America. You just got to promise not to fight anymore, which, believe it or not, no one did because they were men of honor, and it was more important to them to be honorable, generally in the face of God, than to go back on their word and fight for their country. Did happen sometimes, but not always. Hale was released. Went back to New Hampshire for 2 years. But part of his deal was after 2 years, if he hasn't been exchanged yet, he's got to go back to prison. Now, you would think, yeah, they found someone to exchange for him, right? No. Horatio Gates, who is one of the hardest American founders to root for, at least for me, of course, decided to talk some trash because it was seen that Nathan Hale was associated with General Philip Schuyler, who outranked Horatio Gates, and how Gates just didn't like that. And Gates actually tried to get a court-martial on him for being afraid or something like that, when it's like, no, he was like captured fighting in a war. So, luckily that court-martial never seems to happen. But 2 years go by and he's never exchanged. So Nathan Hale walks back to Canada and turns himself into the British. I shouldn't have said Canada because he spent his captivity on Long Island. But he does go back to the British and turns himself in like a man of honor. And goes to prison and languishes for 2 more years until eventually he gets ill and dies in a British prison. Because Horatio Gates was kind of a jerk. Sorry if that offends anyone watching. Sorry, Horatio Gates fans. Not my favorite founder. Hashtag not my founder. And he was the mentor to James Wilkinson, who was the worst founder, who I've talked about before, Agent, 13, who literally worked for the Spanish. But okay, I'm getting off topic. Let's finish up here. We've got one more founder today, and 4 minutes to get him in. If we can get it under 45 minutes, that's not going to happen, because we are about to talk about John Tyler. John Tyler, the president? No. John Tyler, the president's father, who had the same name. John Tyler Sr. John Tyler Sr. was an American founder. Believe it. He went to college at the College of William and Mary. And while he was at the College of William and Mary, his roommate was a young man named Thomas Jefferson. So he was already associated with a future president of the United States, which was not a country yet because they were still in college. They hadn't started their founding yet. Now, John Tyler Sr. isn't super famous. He had a kind of a role player, but he served briefly in the war, but he spent almost the entire Revolution in the Virginia House of Burgesses, which became the Virginia State Assembly and goes by several names. But he became actually Speaker of the Virginia House, and he held this for the better part of 2 decades. So through the Revolution, in fact, he's the one who wrote a big thank you to George Washington on behalf of the Virginia State Assembly for, winning wars. So during this time, there's a man named Benjamin Harrison who had signed the Declaration of Independence and becomes governor of Virginia. And as Speaker of the House, John Tyler worked very closely with Benjamin Harrison. 50 years later, Governor Benjamin Harrison's son, William Henry Harrison, would be President of the United States, and John Tyler's son, John Tyler Jr., would be his vice president. And these two gentlemen worked together running Virginia during the early 1780s as the American Revolution came to a close. Fun fact. Benjamin Harrison also had a great-grandson that became president, but that's a different story. The only president to have the same person be president before and after him. Again, getting out of it. We're going to get a little off topic as we end up today because we're going to the Civil War. Well, we'll get there. So, John Tyler Sr. ended up being an anti-federalist, Tippecanoe, and Tyler too. You get it. So, John Tyler Sr. became an anti-federalist and went to the Virginia Ratification Convention, where he worked very closely with his dear friend Patrick Henry to try and stop the U.S. Constitution. Now, this didn't work. Like many anti-federalists who did vote against the Constitutional Ratification Convention, John Tyler then tried to get a job in the federal government as a judge because he spent much of his life as a justice in addition to working in the Virginia House. In fact, he's not usually called John Tyler Sr. He's usually known as Justice Tyler or Justice John Tyler. He doesn't get a job because he was an anti-federalist and Washington didn't seem to care for that kind of thing. And then a year later, he has a son who would grow up to be president of the United States. But then John Tyler does actually become governor of Virginia himself. And just as he resigns as governor, his son, at 21 years old, becomes a member of the very Virginia House of Representatives that he had served as Speaker as for so long, and that started his political career that would lead him to be President of the United States. Now, today's book recommendation is not a founder's one. It's one I read a long time, kind of a long time ago, that I really enjoyed, and it's about John Tyler. It's called President Without a Party. Because John Tyler, and we're done with the founders today, we're going to close with a little off-topic talk about John Tyler, the president. John Tyler became president because the president died. Tippecanoe died. And this is the first time in the history of the United States where the president died. And John Tyler said, I'm president now. And everyone else said, no, you're president temporarily while we have a special election for a new president. And I know that sounds crazy to hear right now because we are used to the vice president assuming the duty of a president who passes away. That's not written in the Constitution anywhere, at least it was not at the time. So when the president dies and you have the vice president saying, I'm in charge, especially at a time where the Federalists had died out and there was really only one political party, it was the essentially the Democratic Party as we know it today, was the only party. People were looking around saying, no, you're not. Like, who do you think you are? But he was fairly forceful with it, and in a way it's a good thing he was, because that's what drove the United States into the method we have now for replacing our president with the vice president. What makes the vice president such a more important office instead of an insignificant office, as John Adams once put it. So, just to finish up here, and I learned this week and did not realize this, John Tyler, 20 years later, actually sided with the Confederacy when the Civil War broke out. He was the only former president to side with the Confederate States of America, and he died during the Civil War. So he was hailed as a hero by the Confederacy. In fact, when he was buried, he wanted a small funeral, but that was not to happen. Confederate President Jefferson Davis actually put a Confederate flag over his grave because he left the United States with the Confederacy. And he is the only former president of the United States to be buried under anything but an American flag. John Tyler, extra bonus half founder today, child of a founder, because I learned that this week and had to share with you. I hope you found it as fascinating as I did. Well, tomorrow we'll go back to the American Revolution, but I just wanted to close with that, because how am I not supposed to share that with you? Thank you guys so much for watching. I appreciate all your help and your comments. Still picturing men in tricorner hat riding alligators. I know, right? I would have loved to see South Carolina invade Virginia on alligators, although I don't think that the headwear would be the major concern, but I appreciate where you went with that, Matthew. Thank you guys so much for watching. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. Please hit like on your way out. If you're new here, subscribe, although I feel like most of you are. Again, I'm sorry that apparently I'm super bright for some reason. I don't know why. This program is weird. It looks super dark here. Maybe this camera I ordered a month and a half ago show up, and I can finally use this brand new setup I built for myself to make videos that are just a little bit crisper and a lot crisper and cleaner than what you're watching right now. I apologize. At least it didn't cut off this week. And what I really hope it'll help is when I do my interviews. Now, I'm not going to have another interview tomorrow. I'm taking a break for a week. We have a special one next week, and then another week after that. Hopefully at that point everything will be set up and I can make my interviews, instead of cutting back and forth on Zoom, I can put us both screen and screen, blow one up, I can have control over it. Like, imagine that, I'm editing a video. So I am taking a break. I'm going to have a special video tomorrow about the interviews, which I think you guys might appreciate. I'm going to talk, I'll give you the heads up if you come this far, if you watch me for an hour. I'm going to discuss the last five the interviews I have done. I'm going to go through them and talk about what I've learned, because this is what this channel is. It's what I learned about the American Revolution. And I've learned a lot from these people who were kind enough to come talk to us. And I just want to give you my perspective on what I thought about what I learned. If that's too meta, I get it. I'm just doing it this week. But I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you, TJ. I'll take bright as a compliment. So you guys are the best. I am going to go now. Fortunately, we are sleep training a baby next door, and my loud voice didn't wake him up. So things really worked out. Thank you guys so much. Any questions, feel free to get at me. And I will be back tomorrow with this fun one. Troy, good job, Jason. Keep up the hard work. The interviews are a great addition to the channel. Thank you, Troy. I really feel like they are. That's why I'm so excited to get the new camera, because, you know, I'm just recording Zoom calls, and it doesn't look great. I know it doesn't. I know the sound is what's most important on videos. You guys want to hear me and the interviewee crisp and clear. But I'm really, really hoping I can make these interviews great. So, thank you so much. Thank you for everything. Thank you for commenting. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And a special thank you to my Patriots. I know some of you are here right now who help on Patreon, help me offset some of the costs of the upgrades. I know it doesn't look upgraded yet because I'm still using my phone, but as I said, that camera should be here by Monday. If not, I'm just going to squeeze my head until it explodes and you'll never watch another video again. Thank you guys so much. I'll be back tomorrow, and round bottom. And I forgot. I gotta hit it twice. Man, I was so good. I said round bottom. I gotta hit end stream and then end. Round bottom.